Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. During his 4-day visit to Seoul, Sung Kim, the U.S. Special Representative for North Korea, reaffirmed Washington's willingness to talk with Pyongyang, stressing the U.S. holds no hostile intent toward North Korea. Meanwhile, North Korea's foreign ministry released a statement criticizing the U.S. for what is happening in Afghanistan. We'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Scott Snyder. Mr. Snyder is director of the program on U.S.-Korea policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Jonathan Corrado also joins me today. Mr. Corrado is director of policy for the Korea Society. He's a non-resident fellow at Pacific Forum and an emerging leader at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
First of all, Mr. Snyder, the U.S.-South Korea just finished their annual summer joint military drills. Sung Kim's visit took place as the two allies were winding down their joint military exercise. What was the purpose of Sung Kim's second visit in 2 months?
Well, the State Department spokesperson said that the purpose was to coordinate closely with its South Korean ally toward the objective of complete denuclearization. But I think that it is also the case that this is a good time for consultations following the military exercises, because historically the period following military exercises is a better moment, a better atmosphere for potential diplomatic engagement with North Korea than is usually the case in advance of exercises.
Yeah, I think that Scott hit the nail on the head. The timing speaks volumes about the content of this visit. Since the Biden administration came into the White House, we've seen a couple milestones so far for the alliance. The negotiation of the military cost-sharing deal, the rollout of America's new North Korea policy, the Biden-Moon summit, and now these recent military exercises. I think it was important for America to be shoulder to shoulder with South Korea when it conveyed the message to Pyongyang that these are purely defensive drills, that the U.S. does not have hostile intent towards North Korea, and that the offer to talk is still on the table. And by way of update, we saw this morning an announcement that Sung Kim's counterpart, No Kyu-duk, has a 4-day trip planned to Washington, D.C. starting on Sunday. So a bit of an agenda to build on here.
Why is Mr. No Kyu-duk visiting Washington when they had already discussed a number of issues surrounding North Korea, especially on the humanitarian aid?
Well, I think the fact that he's coming immediately as a follow-up means that there's an agenda to build on and there's more to work on. I think it's a positive sign that there's continued engagement happening, and it's not just a State Department visit, it's also White House and NSC, so all positive signs. There was definitely an emphasis on humanitarian initiatives this time around, and if we look at the type of projects that are proposed here, these are mostly public health related. That puts them relatively easier on the end of engagement in terms of getting sanctions waivers. So that shows some pragmatism, and it also shows responsiveness to the ongoing problems that are happening in North Korea.
Is South Korea's chief nuclear envoy visiting Washington to further discuss humanitarian aid in details?
I'm sure that'll be on the agenda. I'm sure that there's probably a broader set of issues for discussion. I'm pretty confident that the Moon administration has higher aspirations than just getting humanitarian aid flowing to North Korea. And we'll have to see how those discussions come out in terms of perhaps any additional initiatives that are intended to try to draw North Korea into diplomatic negotiations.
I mean, when we look at the Moon administration's timeline, it does not have that much time left. It also plays into election politics, so there's that to consider as well. But I think there's a hope that there could be something initiated in time to make some progress before the transition, and that's why there's so much activity at this juncture.
Going back to the discussion held in Seoul, especially about the humanitarian aid, No Kyu-duk said Sung Kim and No Kyu-duk, they discussed very specifically about how they're going to provide humanitarian aid to North Korea, which includes healthcare, quarantine against infectious diseases, safe water, and sanitation. Mr. Corrado, did you think this discussion was held because there was some signals from North Korea that they were willing to accept this?
I don't see any signals indicating that there would be receptivity to that type of aid and assistance at this juncture. North Korea has been incredibly reluctant to American and South Korean offers for pandemic-related assistance to this date. But that doesn't mean that it's not worth continuing to try to put that message out there that here's an offer for this type of assistance. It's not tethered to talks. It's not a condition to that you have to restart nuclear negotiations in order to receive this assistance. However, there could be an expectation that we can pave the road to better relations that could kickstart a virtuous cycle, and perhaps that could get us to a place for better conditions to resuming talks.
Mr. Snyder, will North Korea respond to this when they continuously has rejected the offers of help from the U.S. and South Korea in the past?
Well, one reason why I think that the U.S. and South Korea keep probing is that we don't know when North Korea will say yes. And yet, the beginning of any kind of engagement with North Korea is likely to be focused in this humanitarian area. Yeah, I would also note that Sung Kim seems to separate the issue of humanitarian aid from the issue of denuclearization talks in some of his comments. And I think that's the right approach, that the humanitarian space should be separated from denuclearization, although I agree with Jonathan that trying to create the right environment is important, and that humanitarian exchange can be one way of trying to do that.
Meanwhile, North Korea has not picked up the phone on its hotline with South Korea. It was apparently in a protest of the joint military exercise between the U.S. and South Korea. And North Korea threatened it'll respond to the joint military exercise. Mr. Snyder, North Korea so far has not resorted to provocations, but is it too early to say that?
It's very hard to predict the future, but I would say that one defining characteristic of the North Korean approach so far has been to focus on words and not actions. And there are a variety of reasons why North Korea may not want to take actions right now. It's hard to say whether some of them may be technical, since they did declare that they might launch some short-range missiles, or whether they might be political. They see a constraint in terms of the possibility that those actions would actually undermine the prospect for re-engagement, if that's what they are really focusing on and desiring. But I do think that the words were intended to provide a kind of substitute for actions, the way they played out. And I think that most interesting was the coordinated messaging through North Korean ambassadors in various capitals, which kind of seemed like a substitute for an actual action.
Mr. Corrado, why do you think North Korea didn't engage in a provocation before or during the military exercise?
I think that Scott just summed up all the points that I can make and more. The only thing that I'd like to add is that in terms of the words substituting for actions, there also appeared to be some coordination with Beijing and Moscow here. We saw some statements from Russian and Chinese diplomats last week. They called for relaxation of sanctions, removal of troops, and accusing the U.S. of provoking North Korea. So I see this response as a kind of reaction, although it's certainly in a different category than a weapons test for sure.
So do you see the possibility that North Korea might resort to the provocation eventually in a month or two?
The door is open to that. I mean, there's never, they didn't shut down the possibility of doing a test, although it would be a surprise to see them do anything larger than a short-range missile test or projectile launch into the sea. That would be surprising to see, and that would be sort of a paradigm shifter and a game changer in terms of how the U.S. and South Korea would have to coordinate their alliance response.
Mm-hmm. Well, and in fact, I think that Kim Young-chul projected the likelihood of some kind of provocative response, even though the threat was very vague.
And of course, right now, the biggest issue in Washington is what is happening in Afghanistan. And North Korea released a statement regarding this, and it criticized how the U.S. exit from Afghanistan took place. And the statement was mainly channeling what the Chinese Foreign Ministry said about the Afghan situation, but still, it criticized the U.S. in its own words too. Mr. Snyder, what do you think North Korea's intention?
Well, solidarity of China would be one, but I think that more importantly, there is a propaganda opportunity for the North Koreans to point to a loss for the United States that they just couldn't refuse to take advantage of. But I think the more interesting question is, how in the world is Kim Jong-un looking at what has happened in Afghanistan? Here, the Taliban has achieved a major objective that is very similar to a long-standing objective of North Korea, and they didn't even need nuclear weapons in order to do it. And so I imagine that there is a lot of study going on in Pyongyang about how did the Taliban do it and what lessons can be learned that could be useful in trying to get U.S. forces off the Korean Peninsula.
Mr. Corrado, is North Korea closely watching what is happening in Afghanistan?
So I think, first of all, they look at the situation and they see an opportunity, as Scott mentioned, to impugn the credibility of the United States' commitment to its allies. I think certainly there's a constituent, which is a very fundamental difference between the United States' relationship with South Korea and its engagement in East Asia and its objective in Afghanistan. Those are two completely different security situations. So the factors for engagement and withdrawal, the American decision calculus is very different from any contingency that could happen on the Korean Peninsula. And I think North Korea knows that. And yeah, just in terms of the propaganda opportunity here, the KCNA article said that the U.S. is the main culprit undermining global peace and security, right? So again, this is just the narrative that North Korea loved every opportunity that it can get to portray this. It's ready and willing to do that. And of course, the goal to reduce the U.S. military footprint and influence projection in East Asia is also consistent with the goals of Beijing and Moscow. So we see lots of overlap there.
Is the Afghan situation comparable to the Korean Peninsula? There are many people in South Korea that someday the U.S. troops might be pulling out from the Korean Peninsula as well, just like in Afghanistan.
So, I mean, I think the fundamental difference is the nature of a long-standing and dynamic alliance that has lasted over coming up on 70 years. A commitment that, although there has been some discussions about, should there be troop reductions on the peninsula, we saw that previously with the Trump administration and with the Carter administration. There has been some changes in terms of the amount of U.S. troops on the peninsula, but they have stayed there. They have remained there. And this isn't a commitment that is just about military to military. It's not a commitment that's just about interest, although we share plenty of those, ranging from security to economics. But it's also a commitment that is rooted in our shared values, things like democracy, human rights. So I think there's a deep affection and a deep bond between the peoples of the United States and Korea. When we look at Pew surveys, we see that regularly the U.S. and South Korean populace tend to evaluate one another very, very highly. So I think that this is not a thinly rooted alliance, and that makes this a very different kettle of fish. And then, of course, to speak about the nature of the threat posed in East Asia, not just by North Korea, but also by a rising China. It's just a very, very different type of threat. And so the United States posture there is also very, very different.
President Joe Biden reaffirmed South Korea is fundamentally different from Afghanistan, and so did the White House National Security Advisor, as well as the State Department. How are South Korea and the situation on the Korean Peninsula different?
Well, I think Jonathan was actually touching on what I think is the most important point as we look at the Biden administration worldview, and that is that a major priority of this administration is girding for an enhanced competition with China. And in that context, the Afghanistan involvement has long seen as an impediment and as a drawback and it's a distraction from the need to focus on strategic competition with China. And so that's the fundamental factor, I think, that it's important that the North Koreans not misread as they look at U.S. political will.
Some observers in South Korea say the Biden administration is turning to strategic patience, but former U.S. negotiators or the North Korean watchers in Washington point out that the U.S. has repeatedly shown its willingness to talk, and it is North Korea that is not responding to it. What do you make of this, Mr. Snyder?
I think that the Biden administration has the right posture of willingness to engage diplomatically, but the North Koreans may not perceive that the Biden administration has the right priority. They usually want to be at the top of the president's inbox, and that's not the case right now. But I think from the Biden administration's point of view, there are a lot of reasons to think that the timing is not yet right. One, the North Koreans are preoccupied with their own domestic agenda. And two, the North Koreans have clearly expressed disinterest in joining the pathway to complete denuclearization. And so that means that the likelihood of success from an engagement at this time appears to be low. And so it's hard to justify pushing this to the top of the president's agenda under these circumstances, but perhaps those circumstances will change. And I think a really interesting question is how is the North Korea policy positioned to try to achieve some of those changes as a prerequisite to pursuing denuclearization talks?
Mr. Corrado, as President Biden has got so many issues on his hands, including Afghanistan, is there any risk or possibility of his North Korea strategy appearing to be strategic patience?
Yeah, I mean, I think it could certainly appear that way because the U.S. and South Korea are not going to make concessions that hurt the alliance, like ceasing military exercises, merely to enter into talks with North Korea. So there is an element of patience here. But as you pointed out, there's zero barrier of entry for North Korea to enter into the conversation, to come back to the table. But of course, Pyongyang's leadership gets a vote here. And we've seen some media reports that the new UN Security Council panel of experts report is going to show that North Korea is continuing nuclear and missile development despite the pandemic and sanctions. So they're making their choice, in essence. And the US and South Korea, what they're trying to do is convince North Korea to reevaluate that decision. So there's creative thinking about how to create conditions leading to that. I don't think that this is waiting around, but as Scott suggested, North Korea is not yet ready to enter into discussions, which I think the Biden administration is very different from the way that the Trump administration was trying to do, leader to leader, which I think is something that Kim Jong-un was willing to go along with. But here at the working group level, it's not going to proceed any further unless there's some serious discussion about all the different baskets that were in the Singapore statement.
Mm-hmm. And then really, this is my last question for today. Mr. Corrado first. What could be the next move surrounding North Korea at this moment?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, and I wish I could tell you what the next development is going to be. But I think that there's a danger that, in terms of North Korea's domestic situation, they're undergoing extreme economic hardship. We really do not know what's going on in terms of the pandemic there. They're insisting that there are no cases. As Scott was talking about, the need to get the UN agencies in there is acute. And as time goes on, it only gets more urgent. So a domestic development in North Korea could drive things in terms of how the process is able to go or not. It seems apparent to me that stabilization would be a better foundation. Stabilization of the domestic situation in North Korea would be a better foundation from which to re-enter into discussions. But that appears to be a ways off.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, your thought?
Well, I would say that the U.S.-North Korea relationship right now is kind of like watching an arm wrestling competition. And just because you see stalemate in the respective efforts of the contestants to try to push forward, it doesn't mean that they are not exerting effort. It simply means that not much is moving. And so I think the big question is whether we're going to see a kind of sudden shift that results in a decisive outcome, or whether we're going to see a very gradual development in which it starts to appear that one side is beginning to dominate on the other, over the other. And unfortunately, the issue of stalemate is probably largely beyond our control to predict exactly when it will end. But I think that we can be safe in assessing that both sides are exerting their utmost efforts to try to achieve victory.
Meanwhile, the North Korean regime will be holding a legislature meeting next month where they are expected to discuss the country's economic difficulties and the plans to overcome them. And it'll be keenly watched whether North Korea will send any signal it is willing to engage with the US anytime soon. Mr. Snyder and Mr. Corrado, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having us.
A pleasure. Thank you very much.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.